thank you everybody for showing up and for being here. Really appreciate it. I'm Deb, and my sidekick today is Becca, who has helped on other webinars as well. So we're really excited to get going. Just so that you know, we want to make sure that this is as interactive as possible and that we're very flexible about how we do this so that we can answer your questions. So I have objectives for this webinar. Whenever I create a webinar, I've got objectives to say, what am I trying to teach and what do I want people to learn? So this is about discussing different ways to increase your confidence with interactions with people with a variety of different kinds of disabilities. It's to show you some of the general rules that you can apply to all people with disabilities. And it's to raise your comfort level so that when you're employing people with disabilities, that this isn't one of the things that's a tripping point or something that feels like a barrier. But I'm really curious, what are your objectives for today's webinar? So we'd love it if you could type into the chat either interactions, because you want to learn more about confidence with your interactions, or general rules for communicating with everybody, or raising your comfort for employing people with disabilities. And Becca's going to monitor the chat and let me know what people are voting for. And I'm going to let you guys keep jumping in on that. I'm just going to say one more thing while you're voting. So because this webinar is recorded and the replay will be sent out to you, you don't have to take a ton of notes. You can simply take screenshots or be able to replay it to a certain point where you wanted to hear what I had to say, hear it one more time. There are two resources that are really wonderful ways to teach people more about the etiquette of employment of people with disabilities. And one of them is done by the United Spinal Association. It's kind of like a comic book. It's all cartoons, graphics of the different things that you want to remember about disability etiquette. And I think that it does a wonderful job of teaching people more details about disability etiquette. And then finally, there's a video on YouTube that was created by the District of Columbia's Independent Living Center. It's called Awkward, and they use great humor to demonstrate why certain etiquette is preferred. What happens if you open the door if somebody's trying to use the door to lean on to get into the door? So things like that. So it's very helpful. What to do in an elevator, things like that. So I do really enjoy that. So Becca, what do we?
Yes, so we have interaction seems to be our big one. And we also have somebody who has used the DC video and thinks that it's great. So, but interactions seems to be, it's your number one bullet point and it's everyone else's too.
Excellent. And I'm happy about the comment on the DC video, because that video really is such a wonderful way of expressing interactions. So first of all, I'll introduce myself. So how do I know this? How do I know how to talk about these sorts of things, and what makes me qualified to provide this webinar to you today? And it's honestly because, for one, I've had my career be in disability employment since when I left college. I'm also a person with a disability, so I think that gives me some legitimacy about this. And I think that the most important part of my career is that I spent 7 years at Walgreens teaching them how to employ people with disabilities. And it gave me a great opportunity of understanding the employer's side as well as the disability side. And so being able to bridge that gap for people in the disability community and for people in the business community, helping them be able to speak to each other more clearly, to clear up any misunderstandings and help pave the way to really increase the employment of people with disabilities is my mission. It's what I do, and it's what I'm very proud of being able to continue to do. I do offer a webinar each month on how to employ people with disabilities, focusing on all sorts of different things. So the first quarter, January, February, and March, was why do companies employ people with disabilities? What do they need to do to employ people with disabilities? And how do they do it? It was all about strategy. So if you want to catch any of those replays, I know Becca's going to pop it into the chat. It's on my website. You can also register for the future ones. This quarter, we're looking at kind of these barriers, the things that really slow down employers sometimes, and trying to help erase those. So it's about the etiquette and interactions today. We're going to be talking about reasonable accommodations in May. And in June, we're going to be talking about specifically disability disclosure, disability self-ID, whatever you want to call it. The question I get from employers a lot of times is, how do I know if it's a person with a disability? So for people from the disability community, that can feel very uncomfortable to hear that question, but I want to recognize that that is a common question I receive. So that is one of the reasons it's going to be June's webinar, and we'll discuss all of the parameters related to disability disclosure from the employer's perspective, as well as from the employee with a disability or the candidate with a disability's perspective. So I have a couple of quick polls that I wanted to do. I appreciate you guys jumping into the chat and telling us what you thought there. The reason I asked that question is because I am aware that some of the audience are people who work in the disability space. But that doesn't mean that necessarily as individuals who work in the disability community that we are completely comfortable with all of the nuances of managing interactions and communication with people with a variety of disabilities. So that was why I was asking those questions. But one of the biggest barriers to hiring that I hear from employers is these concerns that they're worried about that they won't know how to talk to employees with disabilities, or that their other employees won't know how to talk to coworkers with disabilities, or that their managers or other leaders, that somebody's going to be nervous about interacting with people with disabilities or talking to them. And that's a concern I hear a lot. And I think you probably all, those of you who do work in the disability community, you hear that as well. It's why we do so much disability sensitivity training and things like that. But the one that I get hung up on is this concern that managers won't know how to manage people with disabilities. And I'm going to talk about that for a second, just to say that I figured out the secret. When I was at Walgreens, what I figured out about the key to managing people with disabilities was strictly that if they knew how to manage people, they knew how to manage people with disabilities. But not all people are put into a management position because they have great people skills. Sometimes they're really good at running a department or managing the budget and all the other aspects of managing a department. And not necessarily, their strengths aren't necessarily on the people side of things. So that when we're talking about managing people with disabilities, sometimes we just have to teach how to manage people and then be able to bring in the disability component of it, which isn't very strong. And the idea that fellow employees will be uncomfortable with coworkers with disabilities is a concern that I have yet to not hear when I'm talking to employers. So as employers, if that's your concern, that is a very natural concern. However, I will say it is the lowest reason on the bar of why things are not successful when companies do employ people with disabilities. It always surprises, it's a very pleasant surprise, myself and the people who are leading these companies to find out that the workforce in general is very welcoming to people with disabilities. And that, of course, and I say this from my experience at Walgreens, not every employee is a really wonderful person. So they won't necessarily, not everybody's going to be a really wonderful person to people with disabilities. But the disability is not the factor that influences how the workforce in general reacts and responds to disability. It has to do with who the people are to begin with. And adding disability in there just doesn't change any of that aspect, and just requires that we continue to work on the culture. Disability doesn't need to be a big factor of that. But this fear, this concern about the managers and the coworkers and other leaders and what other people are going to think or have concerns with, it really provides this uncertainty cloud that comes over an individual's desire to take this into their company and learn how to employ more people with disabilities. So I want to try to alleviate that uncertainty through today's training. This is the question I hear the most. Who counts as a person with a disability? Why is disability such a big deal? How am I supposed to act and not embarrass myself or others? Are there rules that I need to follow? What am I allowed to say and not say? And what else do I need to know? Those are across the board the 6 questions I hear. So let's start at the top. So who counts as a person with a disability and why is disability such a big deal? Those are actually very common questions from the employers that I work with. And they really want to know, why is this such a big deal? And so we'll start with who counts. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, I'm not sure if I'm going to tell anybody here who doesn't already know this, but they define disability as a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. The key words here are physical or mental impairment, and major life activities. So it doesn't make it very clear. It's really not that helpful as a definition in general. So here's some examples. For physical or mental impairments, it could be a physical or mobility impairment, a speech impairment, loss of limb, sensory impairments, neurological, intellectual, mental illness, and social and communication disorders. And all of those are just kind of this realm of medical conditions or medical diagnoses that are attached to the legal definition of disability for the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then within that are these major life activities. So if you have one of those impairments or another impairment that impacts your ability to see, to care for yourself, to lift, reach, bend, hearing, thinking, sleeping, or walking, all of those things are things that are considered major life activities. And if your impairment affects your ability to do that activity, then you fit into the definition of disability for the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I say all of this just to say that a lot of times we're not clear, we as a society are not clear on what we mean when we say people with disabilities. A lot of times our perception is really that we're just talking about people with significant disabilities, people with Down syndrome, people who are blind, or things like that. But disability is actually just a characteristic because it's such a spectrum. It's, where you decide to draw the line in the sand and say this person is disabled versus this person over there is not disabled can be kind of dependent on why you're defining it. So legal rights is the first reason people consider why is it important to be defining or labeling somebody as a person with a disability. The Americans with Disabilities Act obviously is one component of that, and they define disability as I already reviewed. But there's also entitlements like the ability to get special education services while in grade school, and the ability to access veterans benefits for disabled vets. Those are entitlements that the definition for disability is a little different than what I said for Americans with Disabilities Act. Obviously, you need to know for specific treatments or techniques what the disability actually is and where it fits within that spectrum. And funded services, so any kinds of case management services, transportation assistance, or educational or vocational services, all of those things that are funded through the tax services system, those also require this label of disability. So that's why the definition can be important, but really in employment, I don't think it's that important. So let's talk about what does disability really look like? People seem to assume that disability means people who are incapable or unable. And so I have a quiz on my website, and we don't need to take that full quiz. I'm going to do a quick short version of it right now. So here are, I got to count, 7 people who I consider relatively successful and relatively famous. We've got some actors, we've got some presidents, some business people, some musicians, and some scientists on the screen. And I hope you all can see those pictures right now. And with that, the question would be, well, are any of these people disabled? They're all very successful. Are they disabled? And it turns out every single person on this screen is a person with a disability. I want to help people move away from assuming that disability means incapable or not successful or not at the top of the field. You can argue everybody on this screen is somebody who is truly successful and is also somebody who has at least one, if not more, disabilities. So in our country, in the US, we're talking about 20%, 20 to 22%, depends on how you're actually counting things right now these days. But it keeps inching up as we age because age is a huge factor for disability in our country. So when we're talking about 1/4 of the country, you say, well, that sounds like a lot of people. How come I don't see that many? It's because only 25% of disabilities are visible, meaning that you can tell that a person has a disability when you're looking at them. So if we've got the whole country at 328 million people, and we're looking at the disability population, that's 65 million people in our country, approximately. But you can only really see 16 million people with disabilities in our country. So it seems really small. It feels like disability shouldn't be such a big deal. It's not that many people. It really is a lot of people that you just don't expect to have a disability because you can't see it. So as I said, disability is situational. It's really about a mismatch between your abilities and the environment. One of my examples for that is that if somebody's 7 feet tall and they're in a house that has 6-foot ceilings, they are disabled. But if you get them outside, they're no longer disabled. They can stand up all the way. So the whole idea of disability is really about the interaction between the person and the environment. And so in some cases, although people may have that label of disability, they're not necessarily that disabled. And so I want to, again, just try to unattach the idea of disability and ability for work. So it's a big deal. Sorry, one of the questions was, why is this such a big deal? It's a big deal because of the benefits. And we outlined this in the January webinar, so I am not going to beat this horse very far. But it's about expanding the labor pool, lowering turnover, the performance, the workplace safety, the workforce stability, and the efficiency of management in a disability inclusive place of employment is higher than places that don't have people with disabilities. We're talking about job seeker and customer preference, so the market support for this is overwhelming. And the new data on the higher shareholder returns and positive community impact are all reasons that employers should want to employ people with disabilities. So if you're on that track and the hang up is about how are your workforce going to interact with them or how are you going to interact with them, that's what this webinar is about. So 2 other questions I usually get: how am I supposed to act and not embarrass myself or others? And are there rules I need to follow? And I know all of you were saying, most of you were saying you want to know about the rules. So let's get into that now. Wondering these things is very natural. You see a person with a disability and you think, am I supposed to help them? Or am I insulting them by offering help? That's something I hear a lot. And what if I don't know how to help them? So these are the 3 top questions I hear from folks when they're really narrowing in on, what am I thinking when I'm thinking about interacting with somebody who I know has a disability? I can see that disability, or for some other way, I know that they have a disability. So let's go through the rules. But first, it's really important that we stop for a second and realize that for every rule, there is an exception. So as I go through these rules, they're pretty clear, but you need to be aware that every once in a while, somebody's going to say, I don't like you doing that way. That's not how I want to be treated. And we just need to be aware of the fact that that happens. So these are rules, but again, with every rule in the world, there is an exception. Because people with disabilities, even with the same disability, are different and same at the same time. So just as much as every person in our society is different, even when we talk about identical twins, they're still different. Maybe not biologically, but through other ways. So we all have differences, but yet we all have these common bonds that make us very similar as humans, as participants in the society. If everybody here is a US citizen, we've all got that in common. There's a lot of things that we have in common. But the reason that we have rules is to try to help with the larger group, but knowing that we do have individuals in there that rules may not apply to. So here's some do's and don'ts, because the first thing is that you should be treating people with disabilities with respect. So here's some ways to do that: to laugh together, to include, to relax around them, not to be all hyper and concerned, and to listen. When a person with a disability says, I want to be referred to this way, then you want to listen to that. Also, if it's a person without a disability and they say they want to be referred to a certain way, and I'll give you a quick example. So my full name is Deborah. And a lot of people, when they see that, call me Debbie. I don't go by Debbie, I prefer Deb. But if somebody calls me Debbie the first time, I'll just correct them. If after that they don't remember that my name is Deb, that's when I get a little concerned that maybe they're not necessarily being respectful of me, or they're just incredibly forgetful. But that's how we demonstrate respect, is when somebody says that they want to be referred in a certain way, or they say anything, we listen. That's how we respect them. Ways to show that you don't respect a person with a disability are to use baby talk, or to patronize them, to oversimplify things. Just because a person has a disability does not mean you need to oversimplify. Or yelling at them. That's actually something you see a lot when when we know somebody's deaf, is to start yelling, which really doesn't help. Or to ignore them because you're unsure what to do. So you ignore a person with a disability. That's also incredibly disrespectful and not a great way to show that you're interested in interacting with them. The question that I brought up on a couple of screens ago was, so what if I don't know how to help them? Should I offer help? Asking the person is the number one authority out there. I can tell you some general rules. We'll review those. We'll talk about some scenarios where they've been used. But honestly, asking the person is the key. This has to do with accommodations too. So in next month's webinar, when I talk about accommodations, you're going to hear this all the time. This isn't something where we should be figuring things out for somebody else. We need to be asking people what they're interested in, how they want to be referred to, how they want to be helped. There's always that great scenario of an old lady being helped across the street, except she didn't want to cross the street. The person just helped her along the way. These are things we need to be mindful of. We may have wonderful intentions, but really the best thing to do is to ask the person to tell us what they want or how they want it provided. And then if they're unsure or they can't communicate that, that's when you start to take these rules and use those lessons to apply to say, maybe this is how I should be interacting with this individual. Again, the general etiquette rules that apply for people with disabilities. Relaxing and smiling and being friendly, using consideration, manners, and tact. So if we already lack those, we lack them for everybody, not just for people with disabilities. Treating everybody as an adult, assuming that they're not 4 years old, even children like to be treated as adults. Always asking before we help. Until you know someone so well that you finish their sentences for them, you really shouldn't be trying to help them unless it's obvious. And I'll say that we have certain things in our society where we open doors for people. That's considered polite. We let people go first. So don't stop being the polite person that you are, but you may want to ask, should I get that door for you? If you see somebody who may be struggling with a door. I have a friend who uses a wheelchair. And he lives in downtown Chicago, and he was telling me how the other day he was wheeling down the street and he saw somebody run from across the street, the other side of the block, sprint across the street, stopping traffic because it was downtown Chicago, and running over to open the door for him. And he didn't know what to say. He thought, well, I'm perfectly capable of opening that door. I don't want to be, put this person out. But at the same time, he didn't need to be stopping traffic, and he could have hurt himself running across the street. So asking before you help, I think, is a great way to really demonstrate respect, and that's our general etiquette in our country anyway. And giving people the benefit of the doubt when you first meet them. Assume that they're a good person. Assume that they're a capable person. If it's a person with a disability and you can see their disability, or you know that they have a disability, giving them the benefit of the doubt of ability and capability when you're interviewing them, when you are working with them, when you work for them, trying to remove the stigma and the preconceptions we have about disability is one of the best ways that we can demonstrate etiquette in our country. So let's get into some specifics. Assistive devices are an extension of a person. When we're talking about assistive devices, we're talking about canes, crutches, walkers, wheelchairs, augmentative communication devices, the canes that individuals who are blind use. Those are all considered the extension of that person. So even if they sit down and they set that device down on the ground or on a tabletop, that doesn't mean that it's there for you to move or for you to touch. Or if you're sitting with somebody who uses a wheelchair, it doesn't mean you can rest your feet on their chair. Or if you're walking through the mall with somebody who uses a wheelchair, that doesn't mean their lap becomes where you can just dump all your coats and your packages and everything. That's a part of them. And so if you don't know them well enough to interact with any other parts of their body or their things, then you don't know them well enough to interact with the devices that they use to assist them. And I see that happen a lot. One exception to that, I would say, is not necessarily an exception, but a little twist to that is when you're on an airplane and you see somebody with a cane or a crutch that they need to put in the overhead bin, but they're seated now. You can offer to put it up in there for them, and then just make sure that they know which bin it's in case you are not the one to help them get it back down after the flight. Don't touch anything without permission. And of course, it's fine to ask for permission. If there's something's in your way, you can say, do you mind if I move this? Do you mind if I set this over here? But if they say no, then you got to negotiate to see what the solution's going to be. Let's talk about people with speech impairments. And this is a wide gamut of things. So I put up the picture before of President Biden, who has a speech impairment. He has a stutter. And there's actually quite a few people who are famous and successful and have stutters or other similar speech impairments. Don't pretend to understand somebody. If you can't understand how they're articulating things, you don't want to pretend to understand. And I do work with a few people who have pretty significant speech impairments due to cerebral palsy. That is their number one annoyance, is that people pretend to understand them. So if you don't understand them, ask them to repeat it. And it can feel awkward. I acknowledge that. It feels awkward to say, I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Try that again. Repeating what you've understood is a very helpful way to try to, elicit better communication. Say, okay, I got this and this and this, and they can help draw the connection between what you did understand. And using texting, pen, and paper is also an effective way to facilitate communication with people with speech impairments. But one of the things about people with some speech impairments is that they use an augmentative or alternate communication device. It might not be pronounced alternative or augmentative communication device. That can be a communication board that's got pictures on it, or it can be a very elaborate thing like what Stephen Hawking used to communicate, where he actually used his eyes to point at something on a screen and it would generate the speech out of that. Text-to-speech software was using that. So there's a wide range of what an alternative and augmentative communication device can look like. But what it means is that it will take longer to communicate. And you have to have the presence of mind to wait. I was actually testifying in a congressional hearing with a gentleman who uses an augmentative communication device. And his prepared speech statements were fine because he had pre-recorded them, just like I had. I just read what I had in front of me. But when it came to the Q&A, it did take longer. And that's fine because what he had to say was incredibly valuable. And so I just want you to keep in mind that simply because somebody's using a communication device doesn't mean that what they have to say isn't going to help you or be the answer that you are looking for. And so we just need to have some patience sometimes. And again, it's pretty rude to jump into somebody when they're halfway through a sentence to try to finish it for them. However, if you work with somebody who uses one of those devices, eventually you'll kind of work out how to communicate better, relying on that device and then relying on your knowledge of them already. So it becomes a more natural feeling thing over time, just like everything else. It just takes practice, and you're giving it the opportunity to experience it and learn. Suggestions for when people are blind. There can be a differentiation between people who are blind and people who are visually impaired. But some people who are visually impaired need these assistants also. So again, asking a person what they would like or what they need for help is the first step. But after that, you could be asked to guide them somewhere, in which case you want them to take your elbow, not you grabbing their arm or their hand. You want to announce yourself when you come into a meeting room and one of your colleagues is blind. You always want to announce yourself when you come in. Hey, Deb here. And you want to announce yourself when you're leaving. So you can't ditch out of a meeting and try to hide. You got to say, Deb, I've got to go, and move on. Because I've been in meetings with individuals who are visually impaired and somebody exited without announcing themselves. And then the individual who's blind is asking them a question and they're not there. And it's just awkward for everybody that was kind of overlooked. So that's something to keep in mind. When eating with individuals who are blind and you're in a restaurant, if they don't have alternate format menus, you may be asked to read the menu versus the wait staff, or you can offer to read the menu to them. I've got some friends who are visually impaired who do not want me to read the menu. They want to make sure that their experience is fully inclusive, and so they're going to find another way to get the menu, but not from the person they're eating with. And then when we're in work functions, we don't do them right now, but when we're back to in-person work functions, buffets or the coffee station at a conference or a workshop, those are things where you can offer to get those things for somebody, or take them up to the coffee station and orient them to where things are, depending on whether they're visually impaired or completely blind. So I think those are things that can be really helpful when interacting with people who are blind. When presenting like this, you'd want to describe your slides, which I failed to do. So this has a picture of somebody who appears to be blind simply because they have dark glasses and they're using a white cane, which are international symbols for that. Okay. When people who are deaf are hard of hearing, when you're interacting with them, The suggestions I have here really can vary depending on the person. So let's start with people who are deaf. If they use a sign language interpreter, you want to keep your eye contact up with the individual that you're actually speaking to, not the person who's voicing for them or interpreting your speech back to them. You want to be sure that you are maintaining your eye contact with the individual who's deaf, who's either your candidate, your coworker, or a person of interest for whatever reason you are interacting with them. It can feel awkward to not make eye contact to the person who's actually speaking to you, but the etiquette is such that you maintain your focus and your eye contact on the individual. If you're in a meeting and somebody's using a sign language interpreter, you don't want to speak over each other. You want to take your turns speaking so that the interpreter has a chance to interpret for your colleague who is deaf. But there are people who are deaf who don't use sign language interpreters. So there are people who are deaf or hard of hearing who lip read. And therefore, some of the etiquette around lip reading is to make sure that you don't put your hand over your mouth like I just did. You don't want to be eating too much. Although if you're eating with somebody who lip reads, you just don't want to have the food hanging out of your mouth when you're talking. You don't want to over enunciate words. It's actually very difficult to lip read when somebody is over enunciating words, as much of a habit as it is, at least for me. That is, I think, my biggest challenge when I'm interacting with my colleagues who are deaf or hard of hearing, is that I tend to over enunciate when I know that they're lip reading. And I need to be very mindful of that to be able to try not to overcorrect. And again, just like for people with speech impairments, some people who are deaf or hard of hearing, their enunciation is a little challenging to understand sometimes. And so you just need to ask them to repeat themselves. Work your way through that communication, as we talked about. And then I want to touch on service animals. And this can be such a touchy topic because people confuse service animals with emotional support animals. And so I just want to be clear, I'm only talking about service animals. So these are the animals that are protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act to be anywhere that their handler is. They are specifically trained, and you will know that they're a service animal because of their vest or their harness. Most traditionally, we think of service animals as guide dogs for individuals who are blind. However, service animals don't just support people who are blind. I have friends who are deaf and have support animals, dogs, who then indicate to them when the doorbell's ringing, when the phone's ringing, all sorts of things that they do to help the individual be aware of sounds that they should be aware of. There's also dogs that signal seizures for people who are epileptic or have other seizure disorders. This is really, those dogs are life-saving. They can go get assistance, so all sorts of things like that. For individuals who have mobility impairments, service animals can pick things up, can open doors. It's incredible what they can do. But what's key to know is that what you should expect from a service animal is that they are well trained and they are there to serve that individual. So one of the things that I really struggle with is that I think dogs are the cutest things in the world. And all I want to do is go up to every dog I see and rub them behind the ears and pat them down by their tail where it gets them all silly and, get all excited about that. But when a service animal is working, meaning their harness is on or their vest is on, their job is to help the individual with the disability. And so your job as the colleague, as the coworker, as the passerby or whatever, is to sort of ignore the dog. If you can't ignore the dog, then you need to ask, can I pet your dog? Can I feed your dog? I have a treat for your dog. Can I do that? And you need to be prepared for that. They might say no. And the reason they say no is because they really want their dogs to know the difference between when they're working and when it's playtime. And so interacting with other people can really challenge that. So it's really important to keep in mind when we're talking about service animals that we are very respectful of somebody's desire about how.
We have a question there on that as
Great.
well. Is how can you tell if a dog is a service animal versus a support animal? Those vests can be purchased online by anyone. And have you seen a service animal that is a miniature horse? I know that is covered by the ADA. There's two questions, but now I would like a miniature horse. So
those are great questions. And yes, the definition of service animal has been changing slightly. So I am not up to date on my legal details, but I believe it's still simply a dog or a miniature horse. I've never seen a miniature horse serve as a service animal, but I am very clear. I clearly know that that is in the legislation. So that's, and again, this is a service animal. The way that you can tell if somebody's a service animal or not, or just an emotional support animal, is pretty sketchy. So I guess my first question would be, why do you want to know? And typically, if you are an employer, you want to know because if you've got colleagues or coworkers who have allergies, you're going to deal with people with different needs. So ensuring that it's just a support animal that's coming into the premises, or in restaurants or retail. The management of those facilities has the right to ask certain questions. They cannot ask, do you have a disability? But they can ask, what is your animal trained to do for you? And usually when you get that answer, you can tell right away if the person is if the animal is a support animal or a service animal. And so again, the difference, service animals, well trained, they will not poop on the floor. They will not run around the facility, no matter where you are. They will stay with their handler. If they're at a meeting, they're going to curl up underneath the chair as much as they can. Sometimes those dogs are kind of big. In an airplane, they will squeeze themselves into the space underneath the seat in front of the handler. They're just so well behaved. That's how I can always tell the difference. If I'm in a store and I see someone carrying around a dog, first of all, then it's not a service animal, because the service animal will be on the floor behaving themselves on their leash or their harness. So as soon as I see somebody carrying an animal around, I know that it's not a service animal, it's a support animal. So that's one of my ways to tell. But honestly, I guess the question bears, why would you want to be able to differentiate? And for me, it's because I am allergic to dogs as much as I love them. So that if I'm in an airplane seat, I want to know whether I should be asking to have my seat moved or whether I should be asking the flight attendant to have that animal stored in another part of the plane. Restaurants is the place where I see this to be the touchiest, and it's very sensitive because there are a lot of disabled vets who use support animals, not service animals, to assist them with their PTSD. And what I would love to see is to see more disabled veterans organizations making sure that these animals are trained so that they now qualify as a service animal versus a support animal. And I think the whole issue around this is really very challenging from a political standpoint and from a societal standpoint, because we want people to have the supports that they need, but sometimes the supports that they need, other people are, and just bringing their pets with them. And so I'm not trying to say that support animals aren't also important, but they're not generally well trained, specifically to be disciplined, to behave themselves in public. I'm sure there's times when I have mistaken a support animal as a service animal because they are well trained. And as far as I'm concerned, as long as the animal is behaving themselves and they're not getting dog hair into my food or anything like that, then I don't know necessarily why we need to know. But as an employer, you will want to be able to ask the question, what can this animal do for you? And sometimes I know a lot of employers that do let emotional support animals come with their handler to the workplace because they behave themselves. There's certain parameters that are put around it. But generally, that's sort of the whole discussion around how can you tell the difference. Did that answer the question? And if not, please either raise your hand or hop into.
I'll keep a monitor on that if we want to keep going. And if we get up, then we got to thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay. Always happy to talk about that more, but it's a tricky issue. And the winds are changing a little bit within what's allowed, especially on planes. I know that that's been a big stopping point for people and kind of controversial in our country. So the last two questions that I wanted to cover were, what am I allowed to say and not say? And what else do I need to know? And those are just, I frame these questions using that chalk duster font because that's how people word their questions to me. And that's good because that means that they think they're in a safe space, that they can word questions that maybe aren't necessarily politically correct. But that's okay, because what we want to do is get the information to you, not necessarily worry about how you're asking the questions. So how do you talk to people with disabilities? I've covered some of that on very specific people, specific types of disabilities. When we're talking about people who are deaf, you don't want to yell at them. When you're talking to people who you know have a cognitive disability, it doesn't mean you want to oversimplify things or use baby talk, all those sorts of things about talking with people with disabilities. before I tell you what you need to know, I just want to set the frame with, if you make a mistake, you just need to simply apologize and go on. You don't need to hammer home the point that you are truly sorry, which we know you are. When you're communicating with people, when you're worried about etiquette, just apologize and keep going. That's all somebody's looking for, is the recognition that you know that you should have done something differently, and you're taking note of that. So I actually did a training once. It was at Walgreens. It was with a bunch of engineers who said, we're about to go down to this new facility where we're turning on new equipment. And when that happens, they want to be able to interact with all of the workforce, to ask a lot of questions about how the equipment's being used. And they were concerned that maybe they wouldn't know how to communicate with people with disabilities, who they knew were going to be a significant part of the workforce there. So they asked me to put together a training for them. And so I did. And so I put together a very good training. I thought it was good training. They said it was a good training. How to talk to people with disabilities. I said, you got to ask them questions. You have to listen. You need to be concise. You need to explain more when it's needed. And sometimes writing's more effective than verbal, but sometimes verbal or gestures is more effective. And you need to keep an open mind so that you can just continue to find out how to work that through. And the people who attended that training said to me, well, you didn't teach us how to talk to people with disabilities. You just taught us about effective communication. And I said, well, exactly. You don't talk to people with disabilities any differently than you speak to other people using good communication. Now, if you're not an effective communicator, disability isn't going to change that. So if you need to work on those communication skills to prepare yourself for a workforce with people with disabilities, you're also going to be helping everybody else in your workforce, or in your neighborhood, or whomever you have in mind when you're talking about this. But talking to people with disabilities effectively is just talking to people effectively and communicating well. So here's our don'ts. Don't use baby talk. Don't assume that they should be treated as a child. Don't insult them or patronize them. Don't pat them on the head. Oh my God, I've seen that a couple of times and just drove me crazy. Don't oversimplify directions. Don't completely ignore them. And don't assume that you're going to have to provide any additional care or management or supervision just because the person has a disability. And these are don'ts that really apply when somebody thinks or knows that the other individual has a cognitive disability. It's something we see a lot. It's just this assumption that because somebody has a cognitive disability, that somehow their needs for communication are really degraded or minimized. And I just want to confirm that we want to use the effective communication skills that we have with everybody when we're talking to anybody with a disability. And you can use common phrases. This is something I've heard a lot, and I just want to be clear. When you're talking to somebody who's blind, it's okay to say, see you later. When you're talking to somebody who uses a wheelchair, you can say, let's take a walk. Talking to somebody who's deaf or has some other kind of speech impairment, it's okay to say, talk to you later. And if you're talking to somebody who has is missing a limb or two, it's okay to say, on the one hand. And I love that last one, because I have a friend who only has one hand, and he uses the phrase all the time. On the one hand, this, on the other hand, that. And so we don't need to get too hung up on those things or be overly concerned about being to the far extreme of politically correct about those sorts of things. So when we're talking about people with disabilities, that was kind of covering talking to people with disabilities or with people with disabilities. But when you're talking about people with disabilities, currently, people first language is still considered the correct way to refer to individuals with disabilities. You want to say a woman with mental retardation, a man who is blind, a boy with crutches, a girl who uses a wheelchair, a person with schizophrenia, whatever it is. I don't know why you're defining the disability, but if you are, or just the term disability, you want to have people first language so that the person is what comes first. Now, there is an exception that is becoming more and more strong in the autism community, especially. There are quite a few people who are on the spectrum who would prefer to be known as autistics versus people with autism or people on the spectrum. And what's key, I think, is to just make sure that we're flexing. So terminology evolves. what's important to know is that you should eliminate retard or retarded. In fact, that is called the R word. There are campaigns to help eliminate that from our vocabulary. Crippled, lame, crazy, nuts, mute, handicapped. I'm sorry I had to say them out loud. Don't say them. And using the term normal, because if you're using the term normal to mean not disabled, then you're implying that people with disabilities are abnormal. And we don't want to do that. You want to avoid words that evoke pity, like suffer, confined, stricken, crippled, or victim. People have preferences. Just like we have what people want to be referred to for their pronoun, we also have people have preferences related to their disability or their disability status. And so when somebody corrects you or says, I prefer to be referred to as whatever they prefer, again, this is what you want to do. You want to honor that. That's how you show them respect. And the last thing I want to talk about is over-sensationalization, which is a word I made up, but it's this idea that somehow somebody's doing something ordinary, but because they have a disability, it's extraordinary, it's inspirational. People with disabilities are just people. So if somebody's tying their shoe, it's not inspirational. Now, if they are, running a 100-yard dash in 4 seconds flat, that is inspirational, whether they got a disability or not. So to take disability out of the context of what they're doing, to remove this whole idea of like, oh, they're so brave for getting up in the morning. I have a friend who uses a wheelchair. We would go out for lunch, and every once in a while somebody would stop by the table. It's in the South, and they'd say, oh, honey, it's just wonderful that you can get out of the house. And it's like, really? I mean, she's my colleague. She works. She has a life. Just because she has a wheelchair doesn't mean that she can't get out of the house. So approach them as people with human beings. Find common ground. If you're not sure how to interact with them, find ways to bond over similar TV shows you watch or similar hobbies or whatever. You came from the same area, you went to the same school, whatever. Find common ground. Respect them as individuals. So although I gave you all those rules, sometimes rules don't apply to people. So you need to find out if somebody wants something differently, that's how you want to work with them. They're just like everybody else, and you want to be sure to include them. Don't exclude them simply because they're a person with a disability and you're nervous about that. When we're talking about interacting with people, it may feel like that's special rules or that's different. But I want to use this cartoon again to really make the point that if we treat everybody exactly the same, that's called equality. But using this visual, you can see that there are 3 people of different heights, or maybe you can't see, all standing on one box. And a couple of people can see over the fence, but one person can't because that box is not enough. But on the next side of the diagram or the visual is equity. And that's where we make sure everybody has equal access. So in that case, the taller person isn't on the box at all. The person of medium height is on one box, and the person who is much shorter is on 2 boxes. And now all 3 of them can see over the fence. I know there's a lot of other things you can do with this visual, but I just want to make the point that we don't always treat people the same because they are individuals, because their situations are different. And so we want to try to keep in mind these general rules, but we also want to be flexible enough to make sure that everybody's getting the same opportunity. So 2 minutes left, sorry, but questions. I can also stay longer if people need me to.
All right. And Deb, I also just put into the chat for everyone the link again to all of the previous webinars that also has the links for registering for the next set of webinars that we hope to see people at.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
This was wonderful. This is certainly very helpful. Thank you so much. We got some comments there as well. And these are interesting things to relay into social situations of interaction as well, not just workplace situations. So very, very helpful, certainly on that end.
Very true.
And another thank you. And if we do have any questions, certainly people can unmute, raise their hands, or just type into the chat, and I'm happy to relay for you.
Yeah. I also want to observe the fact that sometimes people come up with questions later on. It can be a lot of pressure to say, come up with your questions right now. So please feel free to reach out to me at any point in time to ask these questions. It doesn't have to be just now. As an introvert, I know that it takes me a while to noodle and process things, and then I come up with a question a few hours later, a few days later. So it's always fine to reach out to me with questions, either here, through LinkedIn, or wherever.
All right. So we are right at 2:00 right now. So I believe Deb could hang for a few minutes, but it was wonderful to have everyone.
I appreciate everybody being here. Thank you so much. Hopefully see you in the next one. Any other questions?
All right. Nothing else in the chat. So I think we are great.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. See you next
Thank
time.
you, Deb.
Bye-bye.